Welcome back, everyone. We're very excited to have you again here with us this evening. Watching the numbers go up, we're already over 100, and so we're thrilled to have you with us once again this evening. This is our 10th week with this amazing book, Literacy Foundations for English Learners, and the amazing and wonderful Dr. Elsa Cardenas-Hagen, who has been leading us all the way with also wonderful chapter leads every week. So we're thrilled to have you here again. Before we begin, just a couple logistics. Please rename yourself with your full name, your first name and your last name, if you haven't already. This will help us at the end of the evening when we do the poll, so we have your attendance. So if you could do that right now, that would be really helpful. So welcome once again. My name is Dr. Pam Kastner. I do have the honor of serving as Patent State Lead for Literacy. And joining me tonight from the literacy team is Lisa Bola, who's been here every week with us too, and Amy Cavalier. Tonight we are, can you believe it, chapter 10. Wow, the weeks have just flown by, haven't they, Elsa?
Yes, they've gone by so fast. Well, for us, they have. I don't know about all of our teachers out there.
And I think so too. So our chapter tonight is Writing Development Among English Learners. And we are honored to have Dr. Linda Cavazos, who is going to be leading this chapter along with Dr. Elsa Cardenas-Hagen. So let me begin by telling you a little bit about Dr. Cavazos. Dr. Cavazos conducts research and provides technical assistance to states and districts. She assists districts and schools in preparing teachers to effectively work with culturally and linguistically diverse learners with and without exceptionalities. Her extensive experience centers on the intersection of culture, language, and disabilities, and providing linguistic and academic interventions for English learners and students in special education. Dr. Cavazos holds a PhD in multicultural special education from the University of Texas at Austin. Please join me in welcoming back Dr. Elsa Cardenas-Hagen and Dr. Linda Cavazos this evening.
Thank you so much. What a great introduction. And we're so honored to have Dr. Cavazos with us this evening. And you'll see as we move through all of the wealth of her experience, her knowledge, the research that she's done, but also always in the minds of being a practitioner. And I think that's why we get along so well, because we really consider ourselves practitioners and also great opportunities as always to be researchers as well. And I see some of my familiar faces out there. Some of you have been really great at participating. And so welcome to Dr. Cavazos and welcome to each of you. I'm going to share my screen if that's all right. And we'll begin with each of you knows that the book really is to explore all of these foundational skills for literacy and the key components. And tonight, Dr. Cavazos will be describing this writing process and reviewing with you. And I will chime in as necessary. So as we think about writing, we do think of it as the highest form of language. And, I have talked to you every single week about language. But here we get to that part, when we're talking about expressive language, we're not speaking of that oral, speaking verbally, but here in written form. And what we know is that in the United States, only about 27%, according to the nation's report card, only about 27% of students write proficiently. And then we look at, the differences between, whites and Hispanics, and we see this 22-point differential. Yeah. So we know that we want to do better. And what we focus on in kinder through third, we focus on reading. And then for many states later, they measure writing. And if you're not thinking about writing all the way through, then how can we expect it just to miraculously occur? Just because we're good readers doesn't mean we're good writers. And so when we think about, how does writing begin, I think about my little grandchildren right now grabbing the crayons and scribbling. They were visiting during spring break, and I'm like, oh, there goes the wall. But I'm like, good for you. You know how to grab that crayon. But let's put it on paper now. So they scribble, and then you see this drawing, and then letter-like forms, and finally some what we call the non-conventional kinds of spelling, where you'll see them using the first letter of a word, and then finally they start to use more letters and moving into that conventional writing. But all the while, and Dr. Cavazos will speak to you all this evening also about oral language proficiency. And not only, we're thinking here about the English learners, but it's not only the English learners, it's all students in the United States, really. We need to do better in oral language proficiency, but especially with our students who are, speaking more than one language, that we want to make sure that they're developing those languages quite well, because then we're going to be able to see this in their writing. Linda?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Cardenas-Hagan. And I'm so happy to be here with all of you. I kind of sat in last week, and I was mentioning earlier to your leaders here how impressed I was by your attendance. But I'm glad to be here to talk about writing. I just can't emphasize enough how important it is to teach English learners the rules, but besides the rules, the language that's necessary, and to really focus on that oral languages. Dr. Cardenas-Hagan, if it's okay, Elsa, can I just call you Elsa?
Yes, just call me Elsa.
That's a stretch for me, because Elsa and I are good friends and colleagues. And so, as Elsa mentioned, but it's really important to focus on so many things. And I know it can become overwhelming for some of you, but we do, as Elsa mentioned, look at through a lens of a practitioner, because we are practitioners. And so at heart, and that's where our interest in research and other work has developed. So when we think of culturally and linguistically responsive teaching, we think of the role of language. What role does it play in learning? It plays a very essential role. The role of culture. Can you tease those two out? I would argue no. It's really hard to tease out language from culture because they're so intertwined. And then what are the cultural and linguistic resources that students bring, and are they recognized in the school? It's really important to know what those are, or to activate them for the students, let them use their linguistic resources. Sometimes they're not quite as developed in the target language, English, for example, as you would like it to be, but that doesn't mean that the child doesn't understand, or that there's a difference. It may just be that it's a difficulty while they're acquiring language. So it's really critical to select topics for writing that are familiar to English learners, because if you select unfamiliar topics, now they're using cognitive resources on that, on understanding what it is that you even want. And it takes away from the craft itself and the writing itself. You should activate or build background knowledge. I know we hear that all the time, even with non-ELs, but it's so critical for English learners. They may not have the background knowledge, that you may have to build it. You may have to be able to give them some kind of scaffold to help them understand what you want from them. It's really important that you do that when you assign, or develop a relational understanding. Help them to do that. And that there's ways to do that through semantic mapping and other types of maps that we use, or graphic organizers that we use. When the student is able to create a relational understanding of the topic or subtopics and the associated vocabulary, they're more likely to apply what you've taught them to do. So I really push at all grade levels, and I teach PK through 22. So use a vocabulary bank. Nobody is too old for a vocabulary bank if you can. I know that with younger learners, we say word banks and vocabulary banks, but brainstorm even with your older learners and create conceptual or semantic maps that they can use to structure their writing. It helps them understand those related concepts, topics, and words, and you're really helping them be able to create a better written product. When possible, try to connect the language to instruction, social, and cultural knowledge. Now, colleagues of ours, Lennon Thompson, and I co-wrote an article with her in 2018 on the evidence-based practices on culturally responsive practice and the intersection with evidence-based practices. And there's 4 domains, and they're language, instruction, social, and cultural knowledge, that if you can activate in students, you will really help them be able to conceptualize what they're writing. So all of these are good resources and good opportunities for you to review the things that matter to English learners, because you might be trying to activate something that's active in the monolingual learner's lens that isn't in the mind or the model of this English learner. So to the extent that you can, look for those cultural reference if you can, because it's really helpful to students. Next slide.
So as we look at these language development and the English learner, we've talked about the first language and second language acquisition. And one of the things I want to mention, and I want to bring in Dr. Alba Ortiz, who's a professor emeritus at UT Austin and a great mentor of both Linda Cavazos and myself. And I was just on a call with her this week, and she really reminded the group that, we tend to look at these oral language proficiency measures, and they give us kind of general descriptions. But how important is it for us to look at what they give us both verbally and in written form to get at a deeper level, a deeper understanding of, where are they in this process of first and second language, language development and literacy development, and then as it pertains here in this ability very clearly for writing. And so we could, Dr. Cavazos, we've talked about an exercise that we're going to do today that I think is going to really demonstrate to you that although I know about the oral language proficiency level, and I think I'm understanding about that oral language, and I want you to remember that we practiced at the very beginning, like week 2 and 3, really week 2, looking at language samples, oral language samples, and today we're thinking about not only oral language but thinking about that written language. And so knowing what they understand and what they can say will tell us a lot about what they'll be able to read and write. And all the information that they give us, that's really, that output is how we design instruction. And that's, I think, one of the big points we want to get to this evening, that you have a lot of data, but we have to dig deeper into that. And I think, I was really thinking about that as Dr. Ortiz was mentioning that this week, and I said, no, she's absolutely right, that we do need to dig deeper. And so I think Linda didn't even know that, she was saying all that. And of course, Linda did it automatically. Let's add this and let's do this. I'm like, yep, just right along the side, right? Just like Dr. Ortiz was mentioning. But we really need to think about that foundation of language being the foundation, not only for reading, but also for literacy.
And to be honest, it's really hard to tease out the work that we do. Dr. Ortiz and Elsa and I conduct research together. We're currently we're in the 5th year of research on English learners and multi-tiered system support. And I can tell you that it's really hard to tease out this publication, the work that we do, from the other work. It's so interrelated. So I think Dr. Hagen has mentioned to you before an instrument that we're creating. And what we're finding with the oral narrative scale that we're creating in that other project that we're trying to scale up now, English learner oral narrative scale, is that grammar and vocabulary is keeping, I mean, it's no surprise, obviously, with the English learners, but those are the areas that are so weak. And so that has huge implications for writing. The students are not going to be able to produce more sophisticated writing if they lack the grammar and the parts of speech, the foundational skills that Dr. Hagen mentioned earlier, and then also the vocabulary. So keep all of that in mind, that it's so, you almost can't tease one out from the other. You really can't, because they're so interrelated, the components of reading. But that's where we're seeing when we use our instrument to measure language proficiency levels, it tells us a lot about their ability to write, what's missing and what those gaps are. So,
yeah.
so
I
think
think
that's
to add to that is that once that's all approved by the Office of Special Education Programs and Department of Ed, what have you, that will be available on the MTSS for L's website that I've shared with you. And so Linda Cavazos is the principal investigator for that project Ellipsis that Dr. Ortiz and I serve on, and collaborate with her. But these that's where these future tools, there's going to be more tools coming out, more briefs and more information from what we've learned, these last 5 years or so. And I think it is important to really consider, and we're calling it the ELONs, right, Linda?
Yep, ELONs. English Learner Oral Narrative Scale. And although it's an oral proficiency progress monitoring measure or tool, it tells you a lot of, and this is within MTSS, it tells you a lot about how to structure your instruction and what's missing, what those gaps are. But it also helps with the writing piece. It's so important. We've been very surprised, and we have used it with hundreds of students, English and Spanish, because you can apply it to English and Spanish. And what we find is that where the students are the weakest, it's not fluency, and it's not comprehension, and it's not at oral language measure, and it's not pronunciation. It's got 5 different measures. It's grammar and vocabulary. So that has implications for instruction.
Yeah. And so I think I talked a little bit about this already, kind of jumped ahead of myself, but really thinking about that writing development and thinking about when, you know, that little child begins to get that crayon or marker and starts to scribble and draw. And it's at about the age of 2 to 3 where they start to really notice that the difference between scribbling, drawing, and letter-like forms. And so we see that, and we know in preschool environments, you know, they work very diligently in trying to, you know, have children actually be able to, you know, recognize letters, write letters, and eventually write their own name. And as I mentioned, we celebrate that phonetic spelling or invented spelling, what you want to call it, where it is, you know, they're trying to map on, you know, the sounds that they hear in the language to that print. And then, of course, we know that, you know, spelling, there's like about 250 different spelling patterns in the English language, and, you know, 5 spelling rules, and it makes it quite challenging for our students, but they have to really have those foundational skills that Linda was mentioning to really get to the writing skills. Anything to add, Linda?
No, that's absolutely true. And we think of the foundational skills, it involves starting with phonics. I mean, you start with phonics, you move on to encoding, decoding, you go on to grammar. As I mentioned, the grammar and vocabulary, so critical. But you, all along the way, you're creating the types of scaffolds that the students can use. And I know we're going to talk about that in the next slide, but it's really important to understand that it has to be recursive, because like all students, English learners are not an exception, that they might forget. They learn something and then you move on to the next thing and they might forget some of the things. It's really important that it's recursive until it's really cemented and they can use it without any guidance, and use the skills without any guidance.
Okay. And in the chapter also, you know, Steve Graham and Karen Harris have been working quite extensively over many decades now, thinking about that strategic strategy, instruction, self-regulated strategy. And really, when you think about this strategy, it's just, you know, very clearly good teaching when you think about it, but really talking about that process, and that, you know, the process, Steve talks about the processes, you know, you must and have that planning, that discussion, that revising, the evaluating, and the monitoring with great feedback, and taking it like a step-by-step process is so important. He also does speak about handwriting and you know, or keyboarding, because we know that those are also, we talked about spelling as being the foundational skill for writing, but so is handwriting or keyboarding, because if we don't have great keyboarding skills or great handwriting skills, that inhibits you from writing. Or and if I don't have great spelling, well, I'm not going to use that word because I can't spell it, so let me get around and use another word. But what we know now is how important it is to really have great models, and like Linda was saying, lots and lots of practice. And we're not gonna just take a concept and be able to use it. It does have to continually have that opportunity for practice with the scaffolds. And so for our English learners, you know, they will, and really for all students, they need scaffolds on their writing until they can get to that independent writing. And I think about, how many years it takes to become a good writer. And I mean, even as adults, I find myself, depending on the types of writing you have to do, you continue to improve. And I think going through this process of this writing this book improved, going through the process of working with Linda on different literacy briefs, it really does, getting feedback from your colleagues, it improves the writing process. And so we are lifelong learners, and we are lifelong learners for literacy, and literacy including that writing process.
Absolutely. And I just want to add here that the monitoring progress, it's a critical piece. You need to monitor, but not just monitor and know. It's really important to provide affirming and corrective feedback. All feedback doesn't have to be corrective, obviously. I think everybody now is really firm on that. But that corrective feedback for English learners, you need to be really explicit about what they did wrong, because they may not have a conceptual understanding of that feedback unless you really walk them through, and do it in the culturally and linguistically responsive manner to help reduce their cognitive load or the cognitive demand of whatever you're asking of them. It helps bring down that academic and linguistic load. If they don't have the language, they're going to rely on what else you're doing, your model, to see. If they do have the language, they still need to have a conceptual understanding of the academic tasks. That's really important. The other thing to remember is the culturally and linguistically responsive feedback is important to reduce their affective filter. If you work with English learners, you may know about that filter, that device that's activated in times of stress with English learners, really any learners, but that's a term that's a coin for English learners. When the stress is high, and the student will just shut down, and then learning cannot progress if their affective filter is activated. So it's really important to use that corrective feedback in a culturally and linguistically responsive manner so that the input is comprehensible to them. And we use that term in second language acquisition. Comprehensible input should be just one level above what they know. And it's kind of similar to Vygotsky's zone, of proximal development, that +1 zone. Same idea. You don't want to give English learners something that's 2 to 3 levels above what they know, because they can't link it to what they know if it's unfamiliar and it's too far apart. It's too distal from what they know. That's really important. And then the oral language development piece has to be emphasized all the time. As Dr. Hagen said, these are good practices for all learners, but they're absolutely critical for English learners. You need to be allowing English learners that opportunity to use the language they're learning, to practice it, to make mistakes. There has to be safe enough for them to make mistakes and not be laughed at and not feel like really self-conscious of what they're saying. Provide that ample discussion so that they have that opportunity, and change the grouping settings so that the scaffolds that you provide, both oral and academic, are available to them in different grouping structures. That's really important to them. And then, we hear a lot in our work about that maybe too many scaffolds can really make the work easy for English learners. Do not lose any energy thinking about that. You're helping them be able to do it independently. So vocabulary banks, graphic organizers, partially filled in graphic organizers, we work in special ed. And so in special ed, we always recommend partially filled in graphic organizers. I think that's great practice for English learners as well as they're acquiring language. They're learning things simultaneously, language and content, unlike monolingual English peers who may just be learning content, not the language necessarily. Although I think all people that learn in English are learning more English as they learn. I know we do, as Dr. Hagen said, we're lifelong learners. But the
no, Linda, one of the things I'd like for you to touch upon is, because I just hear in your description, you really, could you just touch upon, how you describe explicit instruction, those steps, and what we're really looking for in explicit instruction, and as it comes to writing? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and explicit, I think everybody has heard the term, but I can tell you, we do many, many presentations in our work, and everyone in lots of observations. Dr. Hagen, we have thousands of observations, all grade levels under our belts. And I can tell you that teachers will say, I want you to observe this explicit instruction, and we're in there and we're waiting for it, and it's all implicit. And so it's really important that you model that the students, you make it so clear that there's no guessing. There's no guessing. Step by step. The gradual release model is so critical for this work. Make sure that you model. And I like to show, the gradual release model where at the top it's 90-10, 90% teacher doing, 10% students. And then in the middle, it becomes more 50-50 with that guided practice. And then in the independent practice, it's 90-10. And the 10 is there because with English learners, they're still going to need linguistic scaffold sometimes, or there might still be language that's missing. They know what they want to say. And you're going to see in a minute when we walk you through a writing sample that they know what they want to say, but they may not be saying it in the way where it's going to get measured appropriately. And so all of those things are really important. So ask yourself, did I give enough instruction so that the child can do it independently? If the answer is maybe, then you need to explicit, do some more of the explicit instruction. Now, I also hear from teachers that we hear in our work, and we've done a lot of observations together as well, where we sit there and talk about what we saw and what we didn't see, that too much explicit instruction keeps them from learning on their own or exploratory, whatever. Do not worry about those things. Most students need it. Look at as Dr. Hagen said, look at the performance across the nation. I don't think there's any state that can say, we don't need this type of instruction. There's so many students who struggle. And I also work with students of poverty that are only English speakers, Caucasian students that only speak English, that are of poverty and underperforming. And we see some very similar profiles. Explicit instruction has the best available research base for what students who have difficulties need. And I think that message is coming across now. We see a lot of states asking for support with the science of reading and structured literacy and other things like that. And that's because that's what works with students. So if it's not step-by-step and any student can do it on their own, then it's likely not explicit enough. Build them in. And for English learners, it's not just step by step. There has to be visual, nonverbal, other scaffolds that you build in so that it's really clear. You have a magnificent opportunity with the internet. All language can become comprehensible by just looking up an image, and especially with concepts that are very conceptually complex. Like if you wanted to have a student describe what a tsunami is, it's really hard to say that in words. But if you showed them a very quick 1-minute video or some kind of illustration or a photo of that, they may get it much quicker than if you just use a bunch of words to explain it. So use those visual cues that you have. And if you pre-plan, and I hope all teachers do, but I can't say that our observations have really mirrored that. If you pre-plan, then you have that readily available at your fingertips. So yeah, explicit, I can't say that enough. And I hope that's enough, Dr. Hagen, to get the point across.
As you were speaking and I was looking at this slide in front of me and thinking about, Steve Graham and Karen Harris and the work that they've been doing, it really makes me think of there in the message here is explicit instruction. And oftentimes, like you're saying, we think we are explicit, but when we get into classrooms, it's not, all those features aren't always there. The I do, the we do, the you do, right? And so I think it's so important, especially in this process that we're describing.
So in terms of the gradual release model in writing, one suggestion that I often give to teachers, particularly teachers in the middle grades, but I mean, this is true for any grades, is when you do use the gradual release model and you have a topic and you want everybody to write, let's say an essay on, the teacher should help write as a group, everybody. She should help write first, give them an example, help write the first paragraph, just as an example. And then in small groups, they could co-construct a paragraph. I'm just trying to show you how you could use the gradual release model with scaffolds. And then every ending, every subsequent paragraph has to be done at the student level. So every ending can potentially be different in an essay, but you're going to have that scaffolded guidance. You're going to have the modeling. You're going to have the guided practice, doing it co-constructing, and then co-constructing in a small group, and then the independent practice. That's just a suggestion I often give, because otherwise you're going to end up with products that don't resemble what you wanted. When you provide that level of scaffolds, they get it. And then the next time, another topic, they have a really solid understanding of what an essay needs to consist of. And depending on what it is, your task is, it might be 5 paragraphs, it might be 3, it might be whatever it is. Typically, it's not less than 5 for an essay. But that would be one way for you kind of visualize the gradual release model in a writing assignment.
Thank you. That's a great example. All right. So as we think about this, Linda probably touched about, but really thinking about those multiple levels of language knowledge. And so sometimes we think about, and here's the thing, we don't want to work in silos, and I always talk about that. And so we want listening, speaking, reading, and writing. But I might be working with a beginner. So, I can't do writing because this is a beginner. But as Linda says, is if we are modeling and giving, sentence stems or, partially filled out information, you can get that done even at the beginner level. And so I think the message is we don't wait until they've developed all of their language and all of their reading skills to get to writing. We need to be incorporating writing into everything that we do. Linda, do you want to add to that?
Absolutely. One big practice that we have promoted for years that we see such growth is there should be, and we call it, it might be a misnomer, but you might call it something different, but use this, is a reading response. A reading response is writing about what was just read. And so, and very quickly after, you don't want to wait 2 or 3 days, immediately after somebody has read and comprehended. And there's different ways to do that. But one way that I really like that I see a lot of good products is what would happen if another chapter was added, or what would happen if it was tomorrow on any story. For the younger kids, any kind of story that's used, narrative story, fairy tale, whatever, what would have happened if, and change it so that they can infer. You're using higher order inferencing, but you're also getting them to write about it. But if you want to stick with just basic, you don't want to expand upon that, then just what did they read? A summary of what they read or something, but always some kind of writing task. And I hear with the lower grades, the teachers say, as Dr. Hagen mentioned earlier, what does early writing look like? It might be an illustration with a bunch of labeled partial phrases, words, and that's emergent writing. That's so important because students you can build their self-confidence with that, even labeling and multi words put together as they develop writing. And then using Dr. Hagen mentioned, and it's so useful for English learners, the sentence stems, topic sentence stems, framing of topic sentence or a thesis, a statement that will help them, not stems, starters. You get them started with it. In some cases, stems if they're in kindergarten, where you put the parts of speech, and always, that's another thing that I wanted to mention that I didn't want to get past me. Always, when you teach vocabulary, teach the part of speech. I noticed in the chat there, somebody said that some of these things they've gotten away from teaching grammar and vocabulary. Absolutely true. And publishers have really gotten, there's so many curricula that lacks that, even on the vocabulary cards. Add it in, write it in, use a Sharpie, write it in. So that guarantees you that whether you continue to use that or not, the next person's going to know to say the part of speech. It's really important because it really helps to cement the grammar piece.
Yeah. And the other thing, so I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because in the chapters when we were discussing phonics, we were discussing vocabulary, we very clearly, in everything that we did, we very clearly, even in vocabulary instruction, we're talking about what is the part of speech? How do you use it? So as we go through a language framework, you're always going to think about, how these words function. What's that syntax look like? So that's very important. And also in the book chapter, we give you and provide you on page 197, just really a template for that individual vocabulary. And also what you'll see there is not only the part of speech, but also the use of it and the use of this, particular word in your home language, your second language, making those connections, and then giving those multiple opportunities to practice, to really make sure that they're going to eventually use this. And as we think about grammar, you also have in the book chapter ways in which, what's the same, what's different. If you have native language, you have some conceptualization about how words work in a language. And so how do we connect that? Do they work in similar ways across languages? And one of the big differences, like for us, between Spanish and English, so if we think about adjectives, right? And when we speak, uh, our adjective comes after the noun, and in English it's the opposite, but the adjectives before the noun. And so it's really taking that information and then making that kind of cross language connection so that they also can better learn. But it's not like they come to your classroom without any knowledge of grammar. They have it, especially if they have it in their language, but let's capitalize upon what they've had and let's teach them, yes, this is the same, but this is how it works differently. And so you have some of that in there as well. And Dr. Cavazos talked about those graphic organizers and visuals. That's going to be extremely important in that writing process. So here we're talking about bringing in the vocabulary. Here I'm going to talk about bringing in the grammar. But here I'm talking about, how do I put it all together to make these sentences correct? And how do I scaffold for that? So that's going to be very important for the English learner. And do not, as she mentioned, do not feel like you're minimizing or you're giving them less. No, you're giving them that practice and those structures so that then you can set them free when they're ready, right?
Absolutely. And I saw in the chat that when do you remove the scaffolds? When they're able to do it independently. And so, yeah, just like when you paint a house, the scaffold doesn't stay up. You take it away when when it's all done and you've done your job and the child can do it. That doesn't mean you're not going to have to support some students or provide additional guidance, but it does mean that they don't need that particular thing anymore. But, and I started something that I didn't finish, is it just with special ed, that we can partially fill in graphic organizers. And I've had teachers say that's unfair. General ed teachers say that's unfair to the other students. It's not unfair. When we think about equity and access, you're giving the child what they need. And we're not comparing them to the next student. We're giving them what they need. And I think that's where some of the national issues on equity and access really get confusing. But you're giving the child what they need, and that's your goal. Your goal is to help that child succeed, every child, not just certain children without difficulties and disabilities.
Thank you.
So this was not in the book, but I just think that it would help you understand better bilingualism if we include the work of Francois Grosjean, however you want to pronounce it. But he takes a holistic view of bilingualism. And I hope this helps you understand. And I slipped this in, and I hope Dr. Hagen is okay.
Yeah, no, that's great.
We do a lot of work in differentiated assessment and really just understanding a language acquisition. And you have to understand that a bilingual is not two monolinguals in one person. They're not. I'm bilingual English-Spanish. That doesn't mean that I'm English and I'm Spanish. It's so mixed. It's so mixed. And sometimes you're going to see when English learners, I don't feel like I was an English learner. I was just bilingual from birth, like Elsa, like Dr. Hagen, who are just fortunate enough that we had parents that spoke both languages. But what's important is that you can't separate. The bilingual is not the sum of two complete or incomplete monolinguals, but a unique and specific linguistic configuration that's different for every English learner. Every English learner. It's a total language repertoire. We can't measure it well yet because what are you measuring? Are you measuring their translation in their brain of another language? So I want you to look at this graphic, and this is what's happening in the bilingual brain. There's some, and I'm using English and Spanish here. The English language is in there, Spanish language is in there, but there's some cells that are English and Spanish mixed because either of cross-linguistic transfer, cognates, or just because it's your brain is trying to reason, where does this fit? So half of the world's population are bilinguals, and using the monolingual as a yardstick is questionable, according to him, to Grosjean. But what I want you to understand here is that bilinguals will rarely manage to deactivate one language that's not being spoken when they're speaking the other one. And this can be seen in various types of production and perception interference sometimes. That is the involuntary influence of one language on the other. I was in far South Texas yesterday, and I met with a very educated colleague and friend of mine. And she was talking about, and this has nothing to do with education, but it kind of made me laugh, that she was talking about weight loss. And in Spanish, you say reducir, which is a cognate for reduce, but you wouldn't say she reduced, but she said she reduced. She reduced, and it kind of made me chuckle because I was thinking of this presentation. I understood what she meant because I'm bilingual, But if I wasn't bilingual, it would seem really, really weird, right? I mean, Dr. Hagen, would you agree? She said she reduced, and I looked and I thought, okay, she means she lost weight, because in Spanish, she said, you would say reducir. And so again, that exemplifies what's happening here with the bilingual brain. There's some things in there that it's a cognate sometimes, but sometimes not, depending on how you're using it. And so it's really important to know that that's what English learners grapple with every day in your classrooms. And so the other thing is that in production, one notes pronunciation errors, accidental lexical borrowing, sometimes odd syntactic constructions because of the interference or the use of the guest. That he calls it guest, but it's just that language borrowing sometimes, that residual activation of the other language that can be observed in cross-linguistic communication. So I just thought that this might help kind of show you what we mean, that they're operating. Sometimes they're going to produce, and I hope it helps you understand as we walk you through a writing sample of how that child might have been using both languages and trying to figure out which one to use for the description.
Right. And I'd like to just, funny, we did try to convince the state that we could do a reading exam for the state that would actually take into account, what these students would be, how they would be responding in reading and their writing. And what's very interesting is, there are some tools available, as a speech and language pathologist, where even we're measuring vocabulary and we get a bilingual score. And that's really exciting. But I think in the future, I think we should be able to do this, and I think this would be great work to do. I think we should be able to do this as we think about, literacy as well. So, all right, so we're going to get to.
Oh, yes. And so I'm sorry, I just wanted to review. When you have language errors, and it's a holistic view of writing. When you have these holistic W, because we say holistic, right, without the W, but what do the grammar and language errors in writing tell us? What do they tell us? What do they tell you as practitioners? Maybe you can drop it in the chat, because I know, or you can say it out loud. I don't know.
They can write in the chat. I think.
Yeah, right in the chat. Well, I want your answers, but I know that I'm looking at the clock here. What parts they still don't understand? Very good. But do they also tell you, and I'm talking about language interference, do they also tell you what they know but don't have the word for yet?
Yeah.
Exactly, they do. And so if we take more of that additive lens to holistic view of writing, it would help us give credit where credit is due. And it helps us correct any errors, but in an additive, more positive way than just saying wrong, 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 which is really kind of human nature for us as teachers to identify all the things that are wrong, instead of really focusing on the things that are wrong, but they're on the right path. And, there's some movement for years when I was a teacher of being on a roll instead of honor roll. You're on a roll to something, but you didn't quite get the honor roll, but you're on a roll. And that kind of fits with this kind of logical thinking, I think. And are some errors helpful? Well, we just described, yes. It tells us what we need to do as educators to help that child create the type of writing product that we want. And then I think, Dr. Hagen, there's one more. Should some writing errors receive credit? Why or why not? Well, you know what side I'm on, but.
Yes, of course they should.
Give credit where credit is due.
Yes. So we want to set this up for you. This is.
Yeah.
Is that, do you have the
No,
right?
That's it.
Yes. Okay. So one of the, I want you to look at this picture and, take, look carefully. And this is going to be a writing sample from Felix. Felix is in the first grade. He's a Spanish speaking English learner. And he is, this is like the very second semester of the first grade year. And as you think about the oral language proficiency, the school has them at the intermediate stage. And so the directions are to look at this picture and try to describe all that you see going on. And you can even give names to persons, but how would you describe this picture? So in your mind, think about what descriptors what would you write? And now we're going to take a look at Felix and what he was able to write. It says there, I see a dog running away of his owner, and then he goes, his house, and there's children everywhere, and a tree is with fire, and a father and the family is calling the firefighters, because they're scared, and a car is stuck with leaves and branches, and it is raining outside, and a person's with a rope of water for take off the fire of the tree, and everything is wet and is making a mess in the city. So what we're going to do, Dr. Cavazos suggested that this could be overwhelming to look at everything at once. And so we're going to go through kind of looking at these errors and thinking about how they can inform instruction and how we could take this apart and really work with Felix. Linda?
Yeah, so in this first section, you may have already figured it out before Dr. Hagen read it, but this is what the child wrote and this is what the child meant. Go ahead, Dr. Hagen.
Yeah, so
if you press it, should come
you see there, the child meant, I saw a dog running away from his owner and his house, and there are children everywhere.
Yeah. So there's a lot of errors.
So when he used that word, that word hogar, that would be right there, what Linda was describing, like her colleague and friend said, reduce, and he's saying, oh God, for house.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, next slide.
And then if we look there at house, I just want to point out, because we talked about spelling, I think, that was last week, I believe. And just look here, his house. So we see there, he's writing hes, right? So there's that, what would I want to work on there? That vowel discrimination between and I. And then I see house. Well, I'm using AU because in my language, ow is AU.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say good for you, the sound, but in English we use OU and the word has that final, E at the end. And then you see everywhere, right? And so I think there's part there. I wouldn't say that everything was in there because you need that everywhere, and that what sound is not in their language.
Yeah, that's how it sounds to them. And they're trying to write it in what they hear, and they can discriminate.
Yeah, so it really tells you, I've got to really get to that, making sure they heard every syllable and hearing that sound v, which in some cases they may be saying B for V, and hearing that WH, that it's air, breath of air, but they're not processing that. And so we would work with them on that. And this was the sentence where he says, a 3 is with fire, and a father and the family is calling the firefighters because they're scared. And that was meant to be, a tree is on fire. A father and his family are calling the firefighters because they are scared. But you see, once again, 3 for tree, right? And he's saying with instead of on. And so that one, once again, would be, that kind of, thinking across the languages. And then remember when I talked to you about the spelling, why do they use D instead of TH? We talked about that last week, that in the Spanish language, that medial D between two vowels is TH of English voiced, like in father, right? And as Dr. Cavazos pointed out, what probably the child's processing is fires, right? Instead of firefighters, right? And then scared, right? Scared. They don't use, AR would be ar in their language, and is closer to that. But look, got the ED, the suffix ED in there. Or the final D, it's the past tense, scared. Do you have something to add to that, Linda?
No, I think you captured it.
All right. You want to do this one?
Yeah, so a car is stuck with leaves and branches maybe, and is raining outside, and a person's with a rope of water. That one really got me. A person with a rope of water, a water hose. They don't have the word for water hose, for take of the fire. So to take out the fire of the tree, and everything is wet and is making a mess in the city. So a car is stuck with leaves and branches. It's raining outside. Persons, or maybe he meant a person with a water hose put out the fire in the tree. And so he's actually drawing a conclusion there, maybe will put out, but the photo doesn't show that it was, put out. Everything is wet and there is a mess in the city. And I thought it was really interesting that he generalized to the city from that corner. So, but you can see there's a lot of errors in here. But is he making a point? Is he drawing something from that? Is he describing in a way that we can get kind of an idea?
Yeah, and I think I'd like to give so much credit to this student, Felix, because as we read what he wrote, I can follow, what he was thinking, and he's describing, and I'm seeing there that he's trying to have those prepositional phrases in there, and trying to go in a kind of a sequence and trying to describe in more detail. So there's a lot of potential here, but some of the things that we definitely want to work on is working with him, first of all, making sure that he has all of the sounds that he needs, especially. So if you look there on the word ranches for branches, so those quick consonant clusters there, and look at that word outside. There's not a lot of words in the Spanish language that just end in D, right? There's not as many. They do have them, but those ending sounds like the ending D and the ending T, those are challenging for Spanish speaking English learners. And you are right. He was able to describe that, get the rope of water. What a wonderful description for water hose, but needing that specific vocabulary to describe. And so that's another opportunity for vocabulary. And when they're saying put out the fire, that really is thinking, for take off the fire, once again, thinking across the languages.
So there's a question here about if it's not a Spanish and there's other languages in the chat. The truth is, you don't need to know Spanish to be able to support this child's English description. You need to be able to look at what are the areas that would be most important. And when we think of instruction, we think of systematic and cumulative, right? So what would be the most important error in a systematic and cumulative way that would be important to correct, that might be visible throughout the different sentences? Because there's also a question of what do you focus on when there's a lot of errors? You don't want to overwhelm the child and fix every little thing. What you want to do is, the first question you need to ask yourself, was the description, did it help you visualize? And that's actually in the next slide, but did it help you visualize? So everything was right. Yeah, so right here, I think, are the questions. Were you able to visualize from that description, even with its errors? Can you visualize and picture through the written or spoken description? That's the first question, because then that means that the child did accomplish that. And then you focus on prioritizing what would the child need most that would help them with the next writing assignment. So that would be really important too. You don't want to overwhelm them and give them every part of speech they got wrong. You can correct or walk them through or break it into chunks like we just did. When you break it into chunks, it's not as overwhelming, even of their own work. So I think that would be really important too. This is a young child. They might get completely overwhelmed. Again, the oral language development is so critical. If that child is speaking it and not writing it, you may be able to understand a lot of this and not focus in on the spelling errors. So it's really important that we don't shut them down. Remember their affective filter, and that we keep them wanting to learn, correct as you go, but not all at once. Dr. Hagan, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so I think that's right, that we look for patterns there. The child did get the description out there. We were able to figure out, what he was trying to describe. And then we think about, okay, so when I'm, working in and teaching, I want to make sure that, the student has this ability of understanding, well, how, of and off, right? Work, and and it may not be just right there at that moment, because I don't, like you're saying, I don't want to discourage. I say, wow, I really understood, and you got a lot of details in here from just looking at that picture. But it is important then to think about, well, what am I going to do in the instruction? How am I going to, so how am I going to help them? I see that there's expansion here. I see that, there's sentences that have detail in them, and I see that there's some great ideas. But how can I help so that the errors in spelling don't get in the way, and that cross languaging or using native language for second language. Oh, these are some little overgeneralizations. Let me kind of work on this sentence structure or this part of speech to get to this sentence structure.
And I think that's also, as we mentioned earlier, where those vocabulary banks would be so critical. If you had a vocabulary bank and you had a little depiction, some kind of image, it would help them write it correctly. And I know that sometimes we can't, that may seem like an impossible scaffold, but this is a first grade student. That's a very reasonable scaffold for this child. They still have to say what they see. They couldn't just drop a whole bunch of words in it and pass that off as writing. And so it would be really important to use that bank, or at least preview that vocabulary before they do the writing test.
Good. And so we talked about, just, did give us information on that grammar, and how there might be some gaps there that need to be addressed. So it's like an opportunity for instruction.
And did they achieve the task? I think we said they did. And I think somebody already chimed in. Thank you, Linda. By the way, I love your name, Linda. About it being graded holistically. I mean, that would be really the goal, because we don't want to be punitive, because again, not just the affective filter, but just in general, we want students to want to write. The best way to want to do anything over and over, even us as adults, is when we're affirmed. You want to affirm students and take that, again, that assets-based approach to your assessment.
Absolutely. All right. So is there something in this session today, and you can put it in your chat box, and is there something that you might consider just from today, that as you look at English learners and at their writing, or some things and ideas that you might take away and can implement, let's say next week? And feel free to talk too. You don't only have to use.
So I see a question in the chat that I'm going to address in a different way, because one evidence-based practice, and Dr. Hagan mentioned, we just finished writing a brief for the Office of Special Ed Programs, Department of Ed, on Tier 2 evidence-based practices and Tier 3 evidence-based practices. And one of the things that we really promote across all tiers of instruction and in intervention is paraphrasing. With English learners, paraphrase it. If they get it wrong, we don't want to point out that's so wrong. What we want to do is give them the correct model. That gets back to the modeling and explicit. Give them the correct model and let them repeat. Let them repeat it back to you so that you hear to see if they have the right enunciation, they got all the syllables, but also right usage, correct usage. In oral language discussions and during oral language development or any kind of classroom discussions, that's easy to do. It's really effective and it's really great for them. Now, somebody asked about error correction. Yeah, we focus on error correction, but not to the point where they end up every other word. You don't want to give them a 10%. If that's what they earned. You don't want to give them a 20, 30, 40% if that's what they earn. You want to focus on what do I prioritize in the way that I'm teaching also to help them do a better job writing on the next assignment. You build scaffolds, you pull them away when they're no longer necessary. But bear in mind, I don't want you to think that it's an easy task. If it was an easy task, American students across the nation would be doing exemplary. And I'm talking about not even just English learners. It's a tough task. It's we are, educators these days are working with a lot of scaffolds, a lot of differentiation, a lot of intervention in addition to their instruction. And that's just par for the course right now. And I think that that is probably due to many, many reasons, none that we have to mention here. The diversity is one of them, and equity and access, there's a lot of things. But I think that it's really important that if you take that really intervention like diagnostic lens to this, you will see the benefit of it for students and you'll get better expected outcomes. And I see the time, so I will stop
Yeah.
talking.
So we'll see that. So some of the strategies, that were mentioned today, we hope that you will be able to, support your English learners. And the main goal here is we want to be explicit and we want to provide those scaffolds that were mentioned. And then we do also want you to think about those cultural linguistic components that you will include in your writing instruction, because we want students to be able to relate to the topic at hand, and see themselves in their writing, in their reading and their writing. So English learners can benefit from explicit writing instruction, which capitalizes upon the target language and cultural and linguistic resources of the student. And that means the other languages spoken. And teachers must understand that each student's level of language is so important to know in order for you to be able to implement successful writing instruction. So as always, we run out of time at the very end. We're a minute past, but we hope from Dr. Cavazos and from myself, thank you for being here this evening. We hope that you were able to get some ideas or some further clarification from the content of this chapter, plus all of the extra, the extra slides and the extra information that Dr. Cavazos gave us this evening from her wealth of knowledge and experience. So thank you for joining us this evening.